My name is Betty Jane Makings Bender. I was born October 3rd, 1925 in Rockport, Missouri, on a farm between Rockport and Tarkio. My parents' names were Earl and Molly Makings, and they were married March 20th, 1912 at Rockport, Missouri by Reverend Gilbert Cox and his little sister Edith Makings and Eunice Slimp, my mother's sister, were their attendants. And Emmett Makings was best man. It was snowy and very cold, and they went in a horse and buggy. That was 1912. This is a picture of, that was way back, and this, the oldest was my dad, the second was Uncle Emmett, and the third was Aunt Donnie. They had 6 children, and my dad was the oldest. He was killed on the railroad, walking home, and a train hit him. And then his wife, Nancy, died just a short time later of pneumonia, leaving 6 children under the age of, is either 12 or 13. My dad was the oldest. So then they were, I believe it was Uncle Tom King that was given guardianship of the children. My parents, as I said, were married in Rockport, and of course it was pretty hard times, depression times, and my oldest brother Eugene was born in, they were, my mother and dad were married, that was, I think I told you, George Earl Makings and Molly Jane Slimp Makings. They were married on March 20th, 1912. Then my oldest brother Eugene was born in March of 1913. Then about 3 years later, I had a sister, baby sister that was, well, Helen Marie, and she died of pneumonia when she was just about a month old. And then my brother Adrian, Willis Adrian Makings, was born in about 1918. And then my sister, Iva Ione Makings, was born in 1920. All of them at Rockport. And then I was born 5 years later in 1925. We were all pretty poor. And my Aunt Cecil, my dad's sister, and husband, Uncle Jess, had moved to Kansas City, Missouri from there. He was a mechanic, and automobiles were just being, coming into use. So he got a job working on the automobile. So she and Cecil read in the paper they were building the Highway 169 from Kansas City, Missouri to St. Joe, Missouri. And they needed workers. So my dad came down looking for work to see if he could get a job helping build the highway. while we stayed with Aunt Donnie and Uncle Charlie Farley. And they already had 4 boys. And then there were 4 of us. And we all lived in that farmhouse, or survived in that farmhouse. I don't know, I think it took a month or so before Dad came back to move us down to Smithville, Missouri. And we've been there ever since. And then I was baptized in the Christian church when I was 12 years old, about 1937. And that was a very important part of my life, because even though my mother and dad didn't go to church, my sister and I did. And we lived on the farm, but we would walk to town to be in activities of the church. And the pianist, Estella Yates, thought I could sing. So when I was a little girl, she had me sing a lot of solos. And I still remember one about, I want to send a whisper song across the ocean blue to say to all the children there, Jesus loves you, loves you. Well, my siblings was, the oldest one was Glenn Eugene Makings. He was 13 years older than I was. But anyway, it was Depression times, and there were hardly any jobs at all for the young men graduating from high school. So President Franklin Roosevelt had established the Conservation Civilian Corps, the CCC camps. And so many of the young men were going to that, and they received $30 a month, and they kept $5 to live on, and they sent $25 home to the families. And that's mostly what we lived on. My dad bought a sack of flour, sack of sugar, sack of beans, and then whatever else we could work, and that's what we lived on, which helped till after we got out of the Depression. In the wintertime, we all made our own playtimes, and I can remember my brothers, when Little Platte River would freeze over, they would play hockey, because they'd just get a rock and then they'd get a stick, and they played, but they had lots of fun. And then they had marble games, and they'd have marble tournaments, and that was fun. And when I remember Eugene, when he was in high school, they had an old tar paper gym, but the boys played basketball, and they had lots of fun, and they had lots of friends. But they sometimes were kind of bad at Halloween, because I know one year Eugene and some of his friends did help bring the outhouse down the middle of Smithville. So they were pretty mischievous, but lots of fun. Of course, we lived in cold houses. Should I go on? When I started to school, we lived out in the country, and we walked to school, except in the wintertime. Adrian and Ione and I all rode a horse. And then when we got to Smithville, there was a barn, and he tied up the horse in the barn until we got out of school, and then we could ride it home. But that was only in the wintertime. The rest of the time, we walked, and it was mud roads. And I remember one Christmas, my sister and I were in the Christian church Christmas program, and we always looked forward to that because you'd get a big orange or you'd get a sack of candy, and we thought that was really great. But anyway, it came a snowstorm while we were at the church, and this was Mrs. Eddie Yates. That was a friend of Ione's, her mother, said, "You all are not going to try to go home in this snowstorm. You're going to stay home with us." And so someone said, "Well, wouldn't your parents be worried? Couldn't you call them?" Well, we had no telephones. They knew someone at the church would take care of us, and they did. The next day, after the snow was stopped and sun was shining, then we walked home. That's why the church has always had a very special place in my heart. I grew up there. Even though we were poor, but we moved back to town in about, I think when I was about 7 years old. And we lived in a house that was right across from the lumber yard. And as I said, my siblings were all much older than I was, so I was kind of lonesome, and I'd play out in the yard. Well, soon it was my best friend to be, Charlene Major, who lived with her grandparents, Charlie and Elizabeth Sheehan, and he was mayor of Smithville. Well, she would come over to the lumber yard because her dad and Uncle Orrin Major were the owners of the Major Lumber Company. Well, she'd come over to see her dad, but she was lonely all by herself. So when she saw me out in the yard, she came over, and we got to be very, very dear friends. And we stayed friends for many years. We played in the sand pile, and then her dad would give her a nickel or a dime to go to the drugstore. But they were always so good to me because they would give me also a nickel or a dime, and we could go get an ice cream cone or a Coca-Cola. We had what you called a little rhythm band. And this is a picture of Charlene, my best friend. And then this is me way over here next to the end. And I was always one of the shortest ones, so I was usually on the end. But we played over the radio in 1933. And oh, we were so thrilled. Yeah, it has the date on it. June 11th, 1933. And I played sticks, I believe, and then we had tambourines, and we had triangles, and well, anyway, and then some played the drum. But it was very meaningful. We had a good time. There were they had sometimes bread lines. Government would offer Spam, because really people were starving. And later on, my sister-in-law's dad had a store downtown, and he was a very nice fellow. And so a lot of the customers would buy groceries, but then they didn't have money to pay for them, so they'd put it on account. And Mr. Hamilton was so kind. He didn't have the heart, because he knew the kids were hungry, that then they couldn't pay their bill. And so eventually I think he had to close his store. But, well, people though kind of banded together. When you say the Depression, we were all poor, but only like the druggist or the banker, or a few lawyer really were affluent. But the rest of us in the town were poor and modest means. I wore almost all hand-me-downs, and we wore skirts made from feed sacks, but we didn't mind because everybody else had a feed sack skirt too. And we pretty much enjoyed our childhood though. We played games, and your neighbors, you didn't even lock your doors because people were honest, and if you needed help, your neighbors would help you. I'm saying like Mr. Shin, we didn't have any money, but Charlene did, they did. But that didn't mean anything. They had a nice car. They'd take me when they took her. And it seemed as though people just helped each other and were caring for each other. And so we got through it. And then the CC camp came along. And of course we always had a garden and tried to raise food as much as we could. And my mother baked all her own bread. Of course, we didn't have radios or, well, later, when I was about in the 7th grade, the radios were just coming in, and electricity, I believe. That is for us. Now, I think downtown, like in Charlene's house, they had, because I remember thinking, oh, they have a gas stove, and they had a bathroom indoors. And I thought, they must have lots of money. But no, the Depression times were, there was good and bad, but it was hard. Everybody did whatever they could. Same way with jobs. My dad helped a lot of farmers, and but you just did what you could to keep from starving. And I loved my first grade teacher. It was Margaret Collins, and at that time, teachers could not be married. They had to be a miss, and she was a Miss Margaret. But oh, I thought, I just loved her, and I know we had slate boards, blackboards, and erasers. So I would, after school, I wanted to go by, and so I wanted to clean all the erasers for her, so they'd be ready to start the next day. And then through school, we just, we had plays. And I remember we went to, in about junior high, we went to the American Royal, and then we had senior play. And of course, when I was growing up again, even those Depression years, we had on Saturday nights in the summer, we always had band concerts, and they had a city band, town band, and they'd play, and then usually the church would have an ice cream supper, and so the farmers would all bring their eggs and their crops to town, and then they'd shop at the grocery store or the Morton Mercantile. And so it was pretty happy times, though, even though we were poor. Well, we lived in the east part of town. And we didn't have a car, so my mother would need some groceries. So I would, after school, I'd walk to town, down to the grocery store. And as I went down to Ben Russell's store, I went right by a garage. And that is where this young man was working on cars. Now, where's that picture? And here he is. Here he is. He was always very slender, but he thought I was kind of pretty. So he would always say, "Hi, good looking." And I'd go by, and I was thrilled to death because I was just young. He had a 1933 Chevrolet, I believe it was a 30 coupe, and it had a rumble seat in it. And so anyway, he had a good friend, Jerry Boydston, and he was going with Marjorie Coram. And so they wanted to go roller skating one time. And so Lowell got up the nerve to ask me to go roller skating with him. And we went down to, let's see, a Wynwood skating rink, I believe it was. And that was my first date. And so he fell down, I remember that, and tore his trousers, and so he was kind of angry at that. But anyway, that was the first date, and this was now in 1940, the summer of 42. And then September 2nd, on his 21st birthday, he left for the United States Marine Corps. The draft was on for World War II, and he knew he'd be drafted, so he joined the Marines. And he said, I remember him saying on his 21st birthday, he was on the train headed to San Diego, California. And I think he was going across Colorado, and I can't think where, well, anyway, so he was in training in boot camp in San Diego, and he wrote me letters and then went overseas. And of course it was war times, so you had to be very cautious what you wrote in a letter because they were censored. It was on a Sunday morning. I think we were getting ready to go to church. And we heard that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor and sunk, what was that, about 3,000 or 3,000 sailors and soldiers had died. And I remember thinking, well, the Japanese ambassador, or anyway, was in Washington, D.C. talking peace with President Roosevelt. And then here they bombed us while he was talking peace. And but then I do remember when President Roosevelt died. I was on an elevator. I'd been working, and I was on an elevator at work, going down when somebody said, "Did you hear the news?" And I just remember being shocked, completely shocked. Well, as I said, Lowell was very faithful in writing to me, but then he had to be cautious. He couldn't tell me, "Oh yes, Yes. This is a picture of him as a Marine. And then this is his brother, William W.B. And he was a pilot. Lowell was a Marine. And then he got to be a, let's see, first class, I think. And he was sent to the Pacific. And of course they had to take the islands, and he couldn't really tell us till he got home, but I think he was in the Marshall Islands. He was also in the Samoa Islands. And then he was wounded on the island of Guam. He started to lie down on a pile of straw or something, and something just told him not to do that. So he moved on over, and then just a few seconds later was when a bomb hit right there. And he was wounded in the back with a piece of the shrapnel. And so then he was in the hospital, I think in New Caledonia or somewhere there. And then later he was sent to Balboa Park Hospital in San Diego. He was brought back to the States, and that was in 1942. So anyway, a couple from Smithville lived out in San Diego, and it was Horace and Jean Jones. And so they said I'd be welcome to stay with them if I could come. So therefore, I saved my money for a railroad ticket, and it took us 2 days and 3 nights to get from Kansas City to San Diego, California. But then it was one of the best times I ever had in my life. We rode the bus downtown, we'd go to dinner to a hotel. Then for New Year's Eve, we rode the bus up to Los Angeles. And I remember we went to a party at the Palladium. And I believe it was Gene Krupa's band. But oh, we just had a wonderful time. And then I came on back home, and he was discharged, I can't remember dates, but in January or February. And then we were married in June of 1945, June 14th. He was very honest, very hardworking, very determined. And so he went to work. Well, we lived in a little old apartment, upstairs, an attic apartment, we called it. And it was so hot, miserably hot. But then, at night, I was still working, but when I'd come home, we'd go out to his grandma's, Grandma Bender's. She had a little farm down around Gashland, and we'd sleep outside because it was too hot upstairs. And then about midnight, we'd get up and go home, where it was a little cooler. But Lowell was going to learn to be a mechanic on the GI Bill. And he worked for Allied Motors. And they were training him on Chrysler products. And so he did real well. But in the wintertime, when the garage was closed up and the motors were running, all those fumes made him sick. So he just couldn't continue that. So in the summer, his dad was building houses, so he said, well, that was outside work in the fresh air, so he would teach him the carpenter business. And so that's what they did. They built houses for, I can't think of his name, but anyway, they built houses for a while, and then, I believe in 1946, we bought the house where we live now. But it only had 4 rooms and a bathroom and a basement. And it had been moved in from the country. But I can remember we bought it for $5,000, and we put $500 down on it. And then we paid $30 a month. And that was about $25 toward the principal and $5 toward the interest. But that was our first home. I was still working, and he was too, and I found out I was pregnant in, 1950. And with my first daughter, Diana Lynn. And we lived there in Smithville, and we had a gas stove, and it was warm. But I was a very foolish mother. I had read so many baby books that it said I needed to sterilize the diapers and sterilize the bottles and everything. And so I did. I boiled the diapers every day. And I had a sterilizer, and I sterilized all the bottles and the nipples every day. So then I was so tired, I couldn't really enjoy the baby. Well, then, my husband had always wanted a farm. And so Uncle Bill and Aunt Addie had owned this little farm east of town. It was 48 acres. Well, Lowell's mother and dad had purchased it from them when they went to California. So then, since he wanted to start farming, why, his mother and dad said we could move out there, and 47 acres he put in corn, and he had some hogs, and so we did move out there. However, there was an outside bathroom and only a pump and a sink in the kitchen. So and then I had to wash out in the shed. But I did have an electric washing machine. And so anyway, then I found out I was pregnant with Nancy. And that was 1952. And here I was pregnant with her, with a little toddler. And then I just thought I'd die. I'd never make it to August. And she was supposed to come about the end of July. But she did not arrive till August 11th of 1952. But anyway, I can remember, I thought, oh, I don't want to go to the hospital early. And about 5 o'clock, I was having, or earlier than that, I was having some pains, and I thought, oh, they'll probably pass. But anyway, they kept getting worse. So finally, I told Lowell, I said, I think maybe I better go to the hospital. And he said, all right. So anyway, Dr. Hobbs was my doctor. He took me to the hospital, and then he went to take Diana up to her grandmother's. And then, by the time he came back, Nancy had arrived. And she was Nancy Jo Bender. After Nancy was born, as I said, we had an outdoor bathroom, and it was kind of hard because then I had to give them a bath in the tub or in the sink. And so Lowell and his dad built 2 rooms, 2 big, nice bedrooms on the south side of our house so that we would have more room back in town, so we'd have more room for our growing family. I can remember with Nancy, she always wanted to take her shoes off. So when she was in kindergarten, when they were through, before she could come home, they'd have to go find Nancy's shoes so she could put her shoes back on and come home. After that, Lowell still helped his dad, did carpenter work, and did some farming too. And we had an old red tractor, I remember that. But he decided that he wanted to farm full time. Well, I just couldn't go along with it because we had to borrow money to start. We didn't have the land or anything, but I was just sure that we'd starve to death because we borrowed money to live on, to get started, to buy some machinery. And then I found out I was pregnant with Debbie. I thought, oh, this poor little baby will freeze to death because there was no insulation on the farmhouse and the windows were not with any storm sash, and I just knew we'd freeze. Well, long story short, we moved out. The house was a mess, so we had to paint and paper and clean it up as best we could, but it did have a bathroom, and it had 2 bedrooms and a dining room. But we had an oil heater in the kitchen, and we had a coal stove in the living room. Well, if you'd get very far away from the stove, you'd freeze. So I remember we put Debbie's cradle in the dining room because that was the middle of the house, and it was about the warmest because we got heat from the kitchen, we got heat from the living room. And so anyway, when we moved out there, my brother and sister-in-law had bought the farm about half a mile up KK Road, where my nephew Phil now farms. And I was going to have them for supper because they were moving and I knew they did not have a stove hooked up. So therefore, I'd invited them for supper. Well, my husband and his dad were working down at the Christian church, closing in the balcony for a nursery for the little ones. So then I thought, I don't feel very good. I'd baked a pie. I remember that. I'd baked a custard pie. And I thought, maybe I better see the doctor. So I called Lowell at the Christian church. He came home and took me to the doctor. And Dr. Hobbs, I remember him saying, well, you're not going to cook supper for anybody tonight. You're going to the hospital. And they're going to serve you tonight. And therefore I did. And then Debbie arrived. I can't remember just what time, but that in a very short time. So I always told Helen and Eugene they got cheated out of their supper because Debbie arrived. But anyway, we lived out there, and Lowell worked very, very hard, but he was very happy. And he bought a stock truck to haul cattle and hogs for many of the farmers, which he loved, talking to all of them, and it was a cash income for us to buy groceries on. And we had lost some money on some cattle, and I said, somebody's got to go to work with a steady income. And so I thought, well, nobody will hire me until I have some more schooling. So I went down to check into Maple Woods Community College. And so I went back to school for about 2 years, and I got a secretarial science degree, I believe it was. And Barbara Murphy and I remember, drove together. But I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the students, and I had to work very, very hard, especially in history, because I couldn't remember all the details. And I'd come home, and after we'd had a lesson, well, then I'd type out a lot of the facts so I could remember it. And, it was really one of the very best moves I ever made. I graduated and with an associate's degree, and then I went to work for Southwestern Bell Telephone in North Kansas City. So then I did work for them 17 years, and then I had a heart attack in 1996. That's it, 96. And I tried to, well, I was in the hospital for quite a long time, but that changed my life, because then I had to, if I wanted to live, I had to change my way of living. And I did not eat a lot of red meat or a lot of fats. And then I had to exercise. They told me exercise and diet. And when I came home from the hospital, I was so weak I couldn't hardly even lift my hands. And I went to rehab and got on a treadmill. They said, you can do it. And I said, no, I cannot. I haven't got enough energy. Yes, you can. So they helped me up on that treadmill, and I went for just a few minutes. Then the next day I had to come back, and I went for a few minutes longer. Till you just keep building up. Finally, I got a little more strength. I tried to go back to work, but then let's see, what did I do? They had to call an ambulance. And I went to North Kansas City Hospital, so that was into my working career. Oh yes, the lake condemned and took the little farm that we had purchased from his mother and dad. And then you had to reinvest that money in land, or you'd pay all that tax on it. So we bought the north 80 acres from at northwest of town from Clyde Collier. And so we farmed that, and then, I don't know my years, but then Lowell got into poor health. He ran the stock truck as long as he could, and then we had cattle. I remember I had to have the neighbor boy help me, and we went out to feed the cattle, but no longer could we take care of that. So we moved back to town to 409 Maple, and let's see, then he really had poor health from then on, if I remember right. And he finally he was in a wheelchair, and he went to KU Hospital, and then Well, in 2005, he passed away. And then Michael, who was a wonderful person, helped me so much after Lowell died. But then he passed away, and that was one of the saddest moments of our lives. And we still miss him. It was better back then, the feeling of that people had with one another. There was much more of a, what would I say, brotherhood. Of course, the town was smaller and the school was smaller, but as a whole, there was more love and tolerance and, as I say, helping your neighbor. For instance, like our neighbor there in town, Virgil Connor, always raised popcorn. He had a little tract. And then he got sick, and he could not harvest it. So Lowell, who lived on this side, and Dan Coleman, who lived across the street, and Fred Jones, who was a friend, all got together, gathered the corn, sold it, and did everything that Virgil would have done, and gave it to his widow. It was just a matter of helping each other. And of course, a lot of the farmers always did that. When we first moved out on KK, why, Mr. French, Mr. Ballinger, and Lowell, they all worked together, putting up hay, and there was more of a, I wouldn't say more, but more of a work ethic in a different way. And seems like now, as prosperity has come, there is more just love of money rather than the helping of people. I mean, that's just my opinion. Truly, I appreciate a furnace, a warm house. Now you say something I appreciate. Well, I appreciate my family very, very much. And I appreciate a car, having mobility, and really, again, Social Security, which I hope sincerely will not be done away with, for I think it's one of the best programs that was ever created. Back when Debbie was in Richmond, Virginia, and she had that, was that Frank, that old car that we had, and their only source of entertainment was they could get enough money for gas to take some side trips. Well, anyway, when her internship was over, she was going to drive back home. And I remember praying, oh Lord, please help that car to make it from Virginia to Missouri and not break down some way halfway in between, because how in the world would I get her? Anyway, when she got back, I think to the, where was she? Someplace in Missouri, she called me. And I thought then, oh good Lord, you've answered our prayer. At least she's in the state of Missouri. That's just one instance that I think of. And there's many more. Well, the invention that I think is really most, that has impacted my life was the coming of electricity, because growing up, we didn't have radios, we did not have TV, and when we curled our hair, We had kerosene lamps, and we studied by kerosene lamps. And then if you curled your hair, you'd put a curling iron on the chimney to get it hot. You'd have to be careful that it wasn't too hot to burn your hair, but then that would curl. You could curl your hair with that curling iron. The same way with ironing a shirt. My mother had to use irons on a wood stove and get them the right temperature to iron my brother's white shirts. And I just marveled at how she could iron them without scorching them and getting them the right temperature, but she did. And then I think the electricity, and of course then getting a furnace, because as I said, we lived in so many cold houses that I'd go to bed cold and I'd wake up cold. And all of my children, I am so proud, all of my children and all of my grandchildren have graduated from college, from high school and then from college. And I have one with a doctor's degree and two with a master's degree and one that's working on a master's degree. My oldest granddaughter, Michelle, was so sweet. She decided to be, I think as a journalist, that journeyman. And she went to Tanzania, Africa, to work with the people there and help evangelize and work with the missionaries. And she did. She was there for 3.5 years, and she did a lot of good work, and she lived with the natives. She said they were a happy group, though. They did not have much money. They didn't have much, but if you had been in a church service and they had anything at all, they'd invite you to come home to lunch and share it with them. But then I thought, oh, just keep her safe. But I'm proud of all of my 7 grandchildren, every one of them, every one of them. Ryan is a salesman. He works for, well, I can't tell you the name of it, but they make limousines and hearses for the mortuaries. And he goes to trade shows and shows their products and demonstrates them. And he's a very good salesman. Very personable, and he's honest. And so I'm proud of him too. And Kelly has done many things. She also has had a trip around the world, and she has gone on mission trips. Seemed like it was Guatemala, wasn't it? And no? Southeast Asia, yes. And then she has come back. She was married, and she has 3 beautiful little children that we adore. And then Jeff figures, if I understand right, he figures water sewer systems, is that right? Costs of them for different towns and so forth. But he does a very good job. And he is married to his wife, Heather. And Tim is quite a successful, he was always good, a good student. He graduated from William Jewell Then he graduated from Missouri MU Medical School. And then he is now a surgeon at Stillwater, Minnesota. And he is married to his beautiful wife, Kata, and they have 2 darling little boys, Alden and John Arlo. All right, then we come to Christopher, who is he graduated from the engineering school at Rolla, Missouri, and then he has become graduated from officers training school. He is now a 2nd lieutenant in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and stationed down at Fort Knox, Kentucky. And I'm very proud of him being in the service. And my youngest granddaughter, Taylor, is now at the University of Arkansas, and she is just about to complete her master's degree to be a speech therapist. So I am proud, very proud of all 7 of my grandchildren. Always do unto others as you would have them do unto you, because I firmly believe what goes around comes around. If you have cheated someone back in your life and you think, oh, you got away with it, it was all right, sooner or later that will come around in your life and someone will probably have cheated you. I just believe with all my heart that being kind to one another and treating one another with respect is one of, well, as the Bible says, you love one another, you live humbly, and you walk daily with your Lord. And I believe so. That's really a recipe to your happy life.